The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic and checked his rifle one final time. At 28 years old, he had spent 6 years serving as a Queen's Guard, a position that demanded unwavering discipline, absolute silence, and complete adherence to centuries-old protocols. His tall, imposing figure stood motionless at his post, the iconic bearskin hat adding to his already commanding presence. James had always taken pride in his role. Growing up in a small town in Yorkshire, he had dreamed of serving the crown since childhood. His grandfather had been a palace guard during World War II, filling young James's imagination with stories of duty, honor, and the sacred responsibility of protecting the royal family. After completing his military training with the Coldstream Guards, James had worked tirelessly to earn his position at the palace, knowing that only the most disciplined and reliable soldiers were chosen for this prestigious role. The palace grounds buzzed with their usual morning activity. Tour guides led groups of excited visitors through the gates, cameras clicking constantly as tourists tried to capture the perfect shot of the stoic guards. James had grown accustomed to the attention, the attempts by visitors to make him smile or break character, and the constant stream of questions directed his way that he was forbidden to answer. His training had taught him to remain as still as a statue, eyes fixed straight ahead, responding to nothing except direct orders from his superiors or genuine security threats. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, the autumn air carried a crisp coolness that James found refreshing after the sweltering summer months. The changing of the guard ceremony had concluded an hour earlier, and now he stood at his designated post near the palace's main entrance, where a steady stream of visitors passed by throughout the day. His fellow guards maintained their positions at strategic points around the perimeter, each one a silent sentinel in the ancient tradition of palace protection. As the morning progressed, James noticed the usual mix of tourists beginning to gather. There were elderly couples with guidebooks, young backpackers with cameras slung around their necks, and families with children who pointed excitedly at the guards. Among the crowd, he peripherally observed a middle-aged woman walking with a small girl, who appeared to be around 7 or 8 years old. The child had curly brown hair tied back with a bright blue ribbon and wore a yellow dress that seemed to catch every ray of sunlight. The little girl's eyes were wide with wonder as she took in the grandeur of the palace. She walked slowly, her small hand clasped tightly in her mother's, occasionally stopping to point at architectural details or ask whispered questions. James could see the excitement radiating from her small frame as she approached his position, though his training kept his gaze fixed firmly ahead. What James couldn't know was that this little girl, Emma Patterson, had been saving her pocket money for months to visit London with her mother, Sarah. Emma had been fascinated by stories of kings and queens since she could read, and seeing the real palace where the Queen lived was the highlight of their week-long vacation from their home in Scotland. Her mother had promised her they would spend the entire morning exploring the palace grounds, and Emma had barely slept the night before from excitement. Sarah Patterson was a single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and this trip represented a significant sacrifice for their small family. She had been saving for over a year to give her daughter this experience, knowing how much it meant to Emma. As they walked through the palace grounds, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction watching her daughter's joy and wonder. The sight of Emma's face lighting up at each new discovery made every extra hour she had worked worthwhile. The morning crowd was larger than usual due to perfect weather conditions and the fact that it was the beginning of the school holiday period. Tour groups moved in organized clusters while independent visitors wandered more freely. The palace staff had briefed the guards about the expected increase in visitors, reminding them to remain extra vigilant while maintaining their traditional stoic demeanor. James noticed that the little girl in the yellow dress kept glancing in his direction. Unlike many children who tried to get guards to react, she seemed content to simply observe, her expression filled with genuine curiosity rather than mischief. Her mother appeared to be explaining something to her in hushed tones, probably sharing information about the guards' role and the importance of their duty. As the hour approached 11 o'clock, the foot traffic around James's position began to increase significantly. This was typically one of the busiest times of the day, as morning tour groups reached this section of their routes, and independent visitors gathered for optimal photography opportunities. The sounds of multiple languages filled the air as international tourists shared their excitement about being at one of the world's most famous landmarks. James maintained his rigid posture despite the growing crowd around him. His peripheral vision allowed him to monitor the movement of people while keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead. He was aware of the tour guides explaining his role to their groups, the constant clicking of cameras, and the excited chatter of children seeing a real palace guard for the first time. The little girl and her mother had moved closer to James's position, joining a small group of visitors who were taking turns photographing each other with the guard in the background. Emma seemed mesmerized by James's stillness and the elaborate details of his uniform. Her mother smiled warmly as she watched her daughter's fascination, occasionally taking photos to capture these precious moments. What none of them could anticipate was that this seemingly ordinary morning at Buckingham Palace was about to take an unexpected turn. The routine protocols that governed every aspect of palace security, the ancient traditions that had remained unchanged for generations, and the unwavering discipline that defined the Queen's Guard would all be tested in a way that no training manual had ever addressed. The convergence of duty and humanity was about to unfold in a moment that would challenge everything James had been taught about protocol, reveal the true character of a man behind the uniform, and create a story that would touch hearts around the world. The incident happened so quickly that most witnesses would later struggle to piece together the exact sequence of events. At 11:17 a.m., as Emma Patterson stood near the ornate palace railings admiring the intricate metalwork, a delivery van approached the nearby service entrance at a speed that seemed slightly faster than the usual cautious pace maintained in the area. The driver, later identified as Michael Torres, was running behind schedule due to heavy traffic in central London and was feeling the pressure of his supervisor's strict delivery deadlines. Emma had wandered just a few steps away from her mother, drawn by a small sparrow that had landed near the base of the palace wall. Her childlike curiosity had captured her attention completely as she crouched down to get a closer look at the tiny bird. Sarah Patterson was momentarily distracted, reviewing their afternoon itinerary and checking the time on her phone to ensure they wouldn't miss their planned visit to the Tower of London. Later that day, the cobblestone area near the service entrance had recently been cleaned, leaving a thin layer of moisture that reduced tire traction more than the driver realized. As Michael Torres attempted to navigate the turn toward the service bay, his van's rear wheel slipped slightly on the damp stones. The vehicle's momentum carried it wider than intended, causing the back corner to swing outward toward the public area where tourists were gathered. James Mitchell's trained eye caught the movement immediately. His peripheral vision, honed through years of security training, detected the van's unusual trajectory within seconds of the slip beginning. While his body remained in its regulation stance, his mind quickly assessed the developing situation. The van was moving at approximately 15 miles per hour, not dangerously fast under normal circumstances, but potentially hazardous given its path and the presence of pedestrians in the area. What happened next would be debated by royal protocol experts for months afterward. James observed Emma Patterson directly in the van's projected path, still crouched by the palace wall, completely unaware of the approaching vehicle. Her mother, now about 8 feet away, had her back turned toward the service entrance and remained oblivious to the danger developing behind her. The van's driver was focused on correcting his steering and had not yet noticed the small child in his path. According to the Queen's Guard regulations that James had memorized word for word, his duties were clear: maintain position unless directly ordered otherwise by a superior officer, or unless responding to a direct threat against the royal family or palace security. Leaving his post for any other reason, regardless of circumstances, constituted a serious breach of protocol that could result in immediate dismissal and potential court-martial proceedings. James had approximately 3 seconds to make a decision that would define not only his career but his character as a human being. The rigid training that had been drilled into him for 6 years commanded him to remain at his post. The regulations were unambiguous. Personal initiative outside of prescribed duties was strictly forbidden. Guards who broke protocol, even with good intentions, faced severe consequences that could include military prison time. But in that moment, looking at Emma's small figure in her bright yellow dress, James saw not just another tourist but someone's child, someone's entire world. His mind flashed to his own sister at that age, to the stories his grandfather had told him about the true meaning of protection, and to the fundamental human obligation to prevent harm when possible. The weight of his rifle, the constraints of his uniform, and the watching eyes of dozens of tourists suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the immediate danger facing an innocent child. The van continued its slide, now less than 2 seconds from reaching Emma's position. The driver had begun to notice the child but was still processing the situation and had not yet applied his brakes. Sarah Patterson remained unaware, her attention still focused on her phone and travel plans. The gathered tourists were beginning to notice something was happening but had not yet grasped the severity of the situation. James made his choice. In one fluid motion that contradicted every protocol he had ever learned, he stepped forward from his post, his rifle remaining in proper position as he moved with the disciplined precision of his military training. His movement was swift but controlled, his years of physical conditioning allowing him to cover the distance between his position and Emma's location in a matter of steps. The tourists around him gasped in surprise. Many had never seen a Queen's Guard move, let alone abandon his post. Cameras that had been aimed at capturing the traditional stoic pose were suddenly recording something unprecedented. The collective intake of breath from the crowd created a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch far longer than the actual seconds it encompassed. James reached Emma just as the van's bumper would have made contact with her small frame. Without hesitation, he scooped her up in his free arm while maintaining proper grip on his rifle, his training ensuring that even in this emergency situation, he handled his weapon with appropriate security. The movement was so smooth and protective that Emma barely had time to register what was happening before she found herself safely cradled against the red wool of his tunic. The van's driver, now fully aware of what had nearly occurred, slammed on his brakes and brought the vehicle to a complete stop just inches from where Emma had been moments before. The smell of rubber and the sound of squealing tires filled the air, emphasizing how close the accident had come to occurring. Michael Torres sat frozen behind the wheel, his hands shaking as he realized how close he had come to striking a child. Sarah Patterson spun around at the sound of the brakes, her eyes immediately searching for her daughter. The sight that greeted her would be burned into her memory forever. Her little girl held securely in the arms of a Queen's Guard, safe from harm, but clearly shaken by the sudden excitement. The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense that her knees nearly buckled. The crowd that had gathered around James's post now formed a wider circle, everyone trying to process what they had just witnessed. Cell phones were already being raised to capture photos and videos. Though many people seemed too stunned to remember to actually press record, the incident had lasted less than 10 seconds from beginning to end. But its impact would resonate far beyond those brief moments. James stood holding Emma, his training warring with his instincts as he tried to determine his next action. He had already broken protocol in the most public way possible, with dozens of witnesses and likely multiple cameras recording every moment. There was no way to undo what he had done, no way to pretend it hadn't happened. His career as a Queen's Guard was almost certainly over, but as he looked down at Emma's wide, trusting eyes, he found that he couldn't regret his choice. Emma Patterson looked up at James with eyes that held no fear, only wonder and confusion. At 7 years old, she didn't fully understand the significance of what had just happened, or why this tall soldier had suddenly appeared beside her. What she did know was that she felt completely safe in his strong arms, surrounded by the distinctive smell of wool and the faint scent of the metal polish used on his ceremonial buttons. "Mummy," Emma called out softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she spotted Sarah rushing toward them. Her small hands instinctively gripped the front of James's red tunic, finding comfort in the solid presence of someone who had appeared like a guardian angel at the moment she needed protection most. James found himself in uncharted territory. His training had covered countless scenarios involving security threats, crowd control, and emergency procedures, but nothing had prepared him for holding a frightened child while maintaining his duties as a Queen's Guard. Every instinct told him to comfort Emma, to speak softly and reassure her that everything was all right, but his training demanded silence. The internal conflict was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Sarah reached them within seconds, her face pale with shock and relief.
"Emma, oh my God, Emma!"
she gasped, her hands reaching out toward her daughter. James carefully transferred the child to her mother's arms, ensuring Emma felt secure throughout the transition. As he handed Emma over, their eyes met briefly, and Sarah saw something in James's expression that went far beyond the call of duty. She saw genuine concern and compassion. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." She held Emma tightly against her chest, feeling her daughter's small heart beating rapidly with excitement rather than fear. Emma seemed to view the entire incident as an adventure rather than a dangerous situation, her childlike resilience already beginning to process the event as something remarkable rather than traumatic. The crowd that had gathered was growing larger by the minute. Word of the incident was spreading quickly among the tourists, and people were approaching from other areas of the palace grounds to see what had happened. James could hear fragments of conversations in multiple languages as witnesses began sharing their accounts of what they had observed. Cameras and phones were now openly pointed in his direction, capturing images and videos that would soon spread across social media platforms around the world. Michael Torres, the delivery driver, had exited his van and was walking toward the group with obvious distress written across his face. He was a father of 2 young children himself, and the realization of what could have happened was hitting him with full force. His hands trembled as he approached Sarah and Emma, his usual confidence as an experienced London driver completely shattered by the near miss. "I'm so sorry," Michael said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I didn't see her there. The stones were slippery and I'm so incredibly sorry." He looked toward James with an expression of profound gratitude. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't acted so quickly." He couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone present understood what he was trying to say. James remained silent, his training preventing him from responding to Michael's words despite his natural inclination to acknowledge the man's obvious distress. However, his slight nod conveyed both understanding and acceptance of the apology. The gesture was minimal, but it was enough to provide some measure of comfort to the shaken driver. The sound of approaching footsteps on the cobblestones announced the arrival of palace security, personnel who had been alerted to the incident by tourists, and staff members who had witnessed the event. Inspector Robert Hayes, a 20-year veteran of palace security, approached the scene with the measured pace of someone accustomed to handling unusual situations while maintaining the dignity and order expected at a royal residence. Inspector Hayes quickly assessed the situation, taking in the stopped delivery van, the gathered crowd, the obviously shaken driver, and most significantly, James standing away from his designated post while holding his rifle in an improper position for a guard on duty. The inspector's expression remained neutral, but James could see the calculation happening behind his experienced eyes as he processed the protocol violations that had clearly occurred. "Sergeant Mitchell," Inspector Hayes said in a tone that was neither accusatory nor approving, simply professional. "I'll need you to return to your post immediately while I assess this situation. We'll discuss the details after your shift concludes." James felt a heavy weight settle in his stomach as he heard his name spoken aloud in front of the crowd. The use of his rank and surname was a clear indication that formal proceedings would follow. He had known this moment would come from the instant he decided to leave his post, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly made the reality of his situation inescapable. Before returning to his position, James looked once more at Emma, who was now securely nestled in her mother's arms but still watching him with fascination. Her small hand waved at him with the unconscious friendliness that only children possess. And despite everything, James felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. As James walked back to his post, the crowd parted respectfully, many visitors offering quiet words of appreciation that he was required to ignore. The weight of their approval contrasted sharply with the weight of the disciplinary action he knew awaited him. Each step back toward his designated position felt like a step toward the end of his career, but also somehow like a step toward something he couldn't quite identify, something that felt more important than any protocol he had ever learned. The gathered tourists began to disperse slowly, many lingering to take additional photographs and share their accounts of the extraordinary event they had just witnessed. Cell phones were buzzing with activity as people uploaded photos and videos to social media, sharing the story of the Queen's Guard who had broken centuries of protocol to save a child. Sarah Patterson, still holding Emma tightly, approached Inspector Hayes to provide her account of the incident. Her voice was steady despite her emotional state as she explained what had happened from her perspective, emphasizing repeatedly that without James's quick action, her daughter would certainly have been injured, possibly seriously. Emma, meanwhile, was already beginning to process the event with the remarkable adaptability of childhood. She asked her mother in a voice loud enough for James to hear, "Mummy, why can't the nice soldier talk to us? Is he shy?" The innocent question hung in the air, highlighting the absurdity of protocols that prevented basic human interaction, even in extraordinary circumstances. As James resumed his position, rifle properly positioned and eyes fixed straight ahead once again, he could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, but for the first time in his 6 years of service, the scrutiny didn't feel burdensome. Instead, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if he had finally discovered what it truly meant to serve and protect. By the afternoon, news of the incident had begun spreading far beyond the palace grounds. Several tourists had uploaded videos to social media platforms, and the footage of a Queen's Guard abandoning his post to save a young girl was generating thousands of views and shares every hour. The hashtag Dahmer's Royal Guard hero began trending on Twitter, with people from around the world sharing their thoughts about James's actions. The palace's communications department found themselves in an unusual situation. Typically, their job involved managing planned announcements and scheduled events, not responding to viral videos of protocol breaches. The footage showed James clearly violating his standing orders, which should have been a straightforward disciplinary matter. However, the overwhelming public support for his actions complicated what would normally be a simple case of insubordination. James completed his shift at 3 p.m., maintaining his stoic demeanor despite the constant stream of visitors who approached his post throughout the afternoon. Many tourists had come specifically hoping to see the guard who had saved the little girl, and several attempted to engage him in conversation or thank him for his actions. Each interaction had to be ignored according to protocol, even though James could feel the genuine warmth and appreciation from these strangers. When the changing of the guard ceremony concluded, James was approached by Corporal Defies, a fellow guardsman who had served alongside him for 3 years. "The inspector wants to see you in his office immediately," Defies said quietly, his expression neutral but his eyes conveying sympathy for the difficult situation James was facing. The walk to Inspector Hayes's office felt longer than usual, each step echoing in the stone corridors of the palace's administrative wing. James had been in this office before for routine briefings and commendations, but never under circumstances like these. The weight of his actions and their potential consequences pressed down on him with each passing moment. Inspector Hayes was waiting behind his desk when James entered, his expression professionally neutral as he gestured for James to take a seat. The office was decorated with photographs spanning Hayes's 2 decades of service, images that documented everything from state visits to security upgrades. Behind his desk hung a portrait of the Queen, a constant reminder of the oath of service that governed every aspect of their duties. "Sergeant Mitchell," Inspector Hayes began, opening a file that James assumed contained his service record. "You've served with distinction for 6 years. Exemplary record. No previous disciplinary issues, consistently high marks in all evaluations, which makes today's events particularly difficult to understand." James remained silent, knowing that anything he said at this point could only make his situation worse. The protocols were clear, and there was no defense for what he had done that would satisfy a military tribunal. He had abandoned his post, violated direct orders regarding interaction with civilians, and compromised security procedures, all in full view of the public. "I've reviewed the witness statements and examined the video footage that's been provided to us," Hayes continued. "There's no question about what happened or why you made the choice you did. The question now is how we proceed." He paused, studying James's face for any sign of regret or defiance. The inspector leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "Off the record, James, I want you to know that if it had been my granddaughter in that situation, I would hope that someone like you would be there to protect her. But you understand that personal feelings can't override centuries of military protocol and tradition." James finally spoke, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I understand completely, sir. I knew the consequences when I made my choice, and I accept full responsibility for my actions. I don't regret protecting that child, even knowing it means the end of my career." Hayes nodded slowly, recognizing the sincerity in James's words. "That's exactly what I expected you to say, and it's why this situation is so complicated. You've forced us to confront a fundamental question about the nature of duty and service. Do we exist solely to follow orders, or is there a higher obligation to protect innocent life?" The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Hayes's assistant entered with an urgent message that would change the entire trajectory of the disciplinary proceedings. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've received a call from Buckingham Palace. Her Majesty has requested a full briefing on today's incident and wishes to meet with Sergeant Mitchell tomorrow morning." The room fell silent as the implications of this development sank in. A direct request from the Queen to meet with a guardsman was unprecedented, especially under these circumstances. James felt his stomach tighten as he realized that his actions had not only violated protocol but had now drawn the personal attention of the monarch he had sworn to. Sir Inspector Hayes dismissed his assistant and turned back to James with the expression that mixed concern with curiosity. "Well, Sergeant, it appears your situation has just become considerably more complex. The Queen doesn't typically involve herself in disciplinary matters, which suggests there's more to this story than we initially understood." As word of the pending royal meeting spread through the palace, speculation began among the staff about the Queen's intentions. Some believed she would personally deliver a severe reprimand for the protocol violation. Others wondered if the overwhelming public support for James's actions had influenced her decision to intervene personally in what would normally be handled through standard military channels. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the story continued to gain momentum. News organizations had picked up the viral video, and reporters were beginning to investigate the background of both the incident and the guardsmen involved. The combination of royal tradition, human drama, and social media virality created a perfect storm of public interest that was quickly growing beyond anything the palace communications team had anticipated. Sarah Patterson had returned to her hotel with Emma, both of them still processing the morning's events. Emma had spent the afternoon drawing pictures of the nice soldier and asking repeatedly when they might see him again. Sarah found herself torn between gratitude for James's actions and concern about the trouble he might face because of his decision to help them. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would add another layer of complexity to an already unprecedented situation. She contacted several news organizations to share her perspective on the incident, hoping that her account as the child's mother might help people understand the human element of what had happened. Her interviews, scheduled for the following morning, would air just hours before James's meeting with the Queen. The palace found itself managing a story that touched on themes much larger than a simple protocol violation. Questions about duty versus humanity, tradition versus compassion, and the role of individual conscience in institutional service were being debated in media outlets and social media platforms around the world. As James prepared for what could be his final day as a Queen's Guard, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 24 hours earlier, he had been an anonymous figure in a red tunic, indistinguishable from the dozens of other guards who served with equal dedication and discipline. Now he was at the center of an international conversation about the nature of service and the value of human life. The irony wasn't lost on him that by breaking the rules designed to make him invisible, he had become more visible than any Queen's Guard in recent memory. Whether that visibility would lead to disgrace or something else entirely remained to be seen. The morning of James's audience with the Queen dawned gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to mirror the uncertainty of his situation. He had barely slept, spending most of the night alternating between rehearsing what he might say to Her Majesty and trying to imagine what his life would look like after his inevitable dismissal from the Guard. At precisely 9 a.m., James stood outside the Queen's private study, wearing his dress uniform with every button polished to perfection and every crease sharp enough to cut paper. Despite the circumstances, his appearance maintained the impeccable standards that had defined his 6 years of service. Inspector Hayes stood beside him, equally nervous about this unprecedented meeting. The door opened to reveal a room that James had only seen in photographs. The private study was smaller than he had imagined, filled with personal touches that made it feel more like a comfortable sitting room than a formal royal chamber. Bookshelves lined the walls, family photographs sat on side tables, and the morning light filtered through windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Her Majesty entered the room with the quiet dignity that had characterized her decades of service. At 99 years old, she moved with careful grace, her eyes sharp and intelligent as they settled on James. She was dressed simply in a navy blue dress with a pearl brooch, her white hair perfectly styled in her signature fashion. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades on the throne, while maintaining a warmth that immediately put James at ease. "Please sit down. Inspector Hayes, you may leave us. I wish to speak with the sergeant privately." James remained standing until the Queen seated herself, then carefully took the chair across from her, his back straight and hands positioned precisely on his knees. The formality of his posture contrasted with the informal nature of their surroundings, creating an atmosphere that was both intimate and official. "I've reviewed the footage of yesterday's incident," the Queen began, her gaze studying James's face carefully. "I've also read the witness statements and spoken with Inspector Hayes about your service record. What I haven't heard is your explanation of why you chose to abandon your post." James took a careful breath before responding. "Your Majesty, I saw a child in immediate danger and I reacted according to my conscience rather than my training. I knew I was violating protocol, but I couldn't stand by and watch an innocent person be harmed when I had the ability to prevent it." The Queen nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "And you understood the potential consequences of your actions?" "Yes, Your Majesty. I was prepared to accept whatever punishment my superiors deemed appropriate." A slight smile played at the corners of the Queen's mouth. "Do you know, Sergeant, that your grandfather served in this very palace during the war?" James looked surprised. "Yes, Your Majesty, though I didn't think that information would be in my file." "It isn't," she replied. "But I remember him. Thomas Mitchell, wasn't it? He served here during some of our darkest hours when German bombs were falling on London and the future of our nation was uncertain. He was a good man, your grandfather. Strong moral character, unwavering loyalty, and most importantly, he understood that sometimes doing the right thing requires going beyond what's written in the rule book." The Queen rose from her chair and walked to one of the windows, gazing out at the gardens where groundskeepers were tending to the autumn flowers. "During the Blitz, your grandfather once left his post to help evacuate civilians from a building that had been struck by a bomb. He too violated protocol, though the circumstances were obviously different from yours." James felt a surge of emotion hearing this story about his grandfather, a man who had died when James was only 12 years old. "I never knew that story, Your Majesty. There are many stories about the courage of ordinary people that never make it into the history books," she said, turning back to face him. "But they're no less important for their anonymity. Your grandfather taught me something valuable that day about the difference between following orders and serving with honor." The Queen returned to her seat, her manner becoming more businesslike. "The question before us now is how to address your situation. You've violated military protocol in a very public way, and there are consequences that must be faced. However, you've also demonstrated the kind of moral courage that we hope to instill in all those who serve the crown." James waited, unsure of what was coming next but prepared for whatever decision the Queen had reached. "I've decided that you will not face court-martial or dismissal," she announced. "However, you will be transferred from active guard duty to a new position that I'm creating specifically for you. You'll serve as a liaison between the palace and various children's charities, using your experience from yesterday to help develop safety protocols for young visitors." The relief that washed over James was so intense he felt momentarily dizzy. "Your Majesty, I don't know what to say." "Say that you'll continue to serve with the same courage and integrity you demonstrated yesterday," she replied. "The nature of service is changing, Sergeant Mitchell. The rigid adherence to protocol that served us well in previous centuries must sometimes give way to the kind of human compassion you showed. I believe your new role will allow you to serve the crown in a way that honors both tradition and conscience." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which the Queen shared her thoughts on leadership, duty, and the evolution of royal service in the modern world. She spoke about the challenges of maintaining ancient traditions while adapting to contemporary values, and her belief that institutions must remain connected to human needs to maintain their relevance. As their meeting concluded, the Queen stood and extended her hand to James. "Your actions yesterday reminded us all why we serve, Sergeant. Not because of uniforms or ceremonies or protocols, but because we have a duty to protect and care for our people. I trust you'll carry that understanding forward in your new role." James shook her hand, overwhelmed by the grace and wisdom she had shown. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I won't disappoint you." "I don't believe you could," she replied with a warm smile. "Now I understand there's a young girl named Emma Patterson who would very much like to meet you properly. I've arranged for her and her mother to visit the palace this afternoon, and I thought you might like to be the one to give them a tour." The surprise and joy on James's face made the Queen's smile broaden. "Sometimes, Sergeant, the most important protocol is simply treating people with kindness." As James left the Queen's study, he felt as though he were walking into an entirely new chapter of his life. The conversation had lasted less than an hour, but it had fundamentally changed his understanding of service duty and the kind of man he wanted to be. The news of his meeting with the Queen and his new role would soon spread throughout the palace and beyond, adding yet another chapter to a story that had already captured international attention. But for now, James focused on the afternoon ahead and the opportunity to properly meet the little girl whose safety had set this entire remarkable chain of events in motion. At 2 p.m. that same afternoon, Sarah Patterson and Emma arrived at a side entrance to Buckingham Palace, both dressed in their finest clothes for what Sarah had described to Emma as a very special visit. Emma wore the same yellow dress from the previous day, insisting it was her lucky dress after meeting the nice soldier. Her excitement was barely contained as they were escorted through corridors she had only imagined from the outside. James waited in the palace's blue drawing room, now wearing civilian clothes for the first time since joining the Guard. The transition felt strange after years of military uniforms, but it also felt liberating. He had spent the hour since his meeting with the Queen processing everything that had happened and preparing for what he knew would be an emotional reunion with the little girl whose life had changed his own so dramatically. When the door opened and Emma entered with her mother, James was struck by how small she seemed in the grand surroundings of the palace. The ornate furniture and priceless artwork that filled the room dwarfed her tiny frame, but her eyes were wide with wonder as she took in every detail of her fairy tale surroundings. "Emma," Sarah said gently, "this is Mr. Mitchell, the soldier who helped you yesterday." For a moment, Emma seemed shy, staying close to her mother's side as she studied James's face. Without his imposing uniform and bearskin hat, he looked much more approachable, though still tall and strong. Then recognition dawned in her eyes and a brilliant smile spread across her face. "You can talk now," Emma exclaimed with the delighted surprise that only a child could express. "Yesterday you couldn't say anything, but now you can." James knelt down to Emma's eye level, bringing himself closer to her height. "That's right," he said with a warm smile. "Yesterday I was working and had to follow special rules, but today I can talk to you properly." "I'm very glad to meet you, Emma." Emma stepped closer, her natural curiosity overcoming any remaining shyness. "Are you really a soldier? You don't look like a soldier anymore." "I am a soldier," James replied, "but now I have a different job. Instead of standing guard, I'm going to help make sure children like you are safe when they visit places like this palace." The conversation flowed naturally as Emma's excitement grew. She peppered James with questions about his life as a guard, the palace, and whether he had ever met the Queen. When he mentioned that he had spoken with Her Majesty that very morning, Emma's eyes grew so wide that Sarah worried they might pop out of her head. "You talked to the real Queen?" Emma whispered in awe. "What did she say?" "She said that you were a very brave little girl and that she was glad you weren't hurt," James replied, which was close enough to the truth to satisfy Emma's curiosity while maintaining the privacy of his actual conversation with the monarch. Sarah watched the interaction between her daughter and James with growing emotion. The gentleness he showed with Emma, the patience he demonstrated with her endless questions, and the genuine care in his voice made it clear that his actions the previous day had come from a place of deep compassion rather than mere duty. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said during a brief pause in Emma's questioning, "I can never thank you enough for what you did. When I think about what could have happened—" She paused, unable to finish the sentence. "Please don't think about that," James replied softly. "Emma is safe and that's all that matters. I just did what anyone would have done in that situation." "No," Sarah insisted. "Not anyone would have risked their career to save a stranger's child. What you did was extraordinary, and I want you to know that Emma and I will never forget it." James felt touched by her words, but he also felt compelled to share something that had been weighing on his mind since his meeting with the Queen. Actually, Mrs. Patterson, I need to thank you and Emma as well. Yesterday you helped me remember why I became a soldier in the first place. It wasn't for the uniforms or the ceremonies. It was to protect people, especially those who can't protect themselves. Emma, who had been listening to this adult conversation with the serious expression children sometimes adopt when they sense something important is happening, suddenly spoke up. Can I hug you, Mr. Mitchell? Mummy says hugs make everything better. James looked to Sarah for permission, and when she nodded with tears in her eyes, he opened his arms. Emma ran into his embrace with the trust and affection that came so naturally to children. As he held her small form against his chest, James felt a profound sense of peace and purpose that he had never experienced during his years of rigid military service. The palace tour that followed was unlike any that had ever been given within those historic walls. James led Sarah and Emma through room after room, sharing stories and historical details that brought the palace's rich history to life. Emma was particularly fascinated by the throne room, where she asked if she could sit on the Queen's chair just for a moment. I'm afraid that's not allowed, James explained gently, but I can tell you a secret about that throne. It's actually not as comfortable as it looks. The Queen once told someone that sitting on it for long periods makes her back ache. Emma giggled at this revelation, delighted by the idea that even queens had everyday problems like backaches. The humanization of royalty through such small details made the entire experience more magical rather than less, transforming the palace from a museum into a real home where real people lived and worked. As their tour progressed, James found himself sharing personal stories about his service and his grandfather's wartime experiences. Emma listened with rapt attention, asking thoughtful questions that revealed a wisdom beyond her years. Sarah marveled at her daughter's engagement and at James's natural ability to communicate with children. The afternoon culminated in the palace gardens, where Emma was allowed to pick a small bouquet of flowers under the watchful eye of the head gardener. The autumn blooms were past their peak, but Emma selected each stem with the careful consideration of a professional florist, explaining to James why each flower was perfect for her collection. As their visit drew to a close, Emma presented half of her bouquet to James. These are for you, she said solemnly, because heroes should have flowers too. The simple gesture moved James more than any military decoration ever had. As he accepted the small bouquet from Emma's tiny hands, he realized that this moment, standing in the Queen's garden with a brave little girl and her grateful mother, represented everything he had ever wanted to achieve through his service. The story of their reunion, carefully documented by the palace photographer with Sarah's permission, would soon join the viral video from the previous day in capturing the public's imagination. But for James, Sarah, and Emma, the cameras and social media attention were irrelevant. What mattered was the connection they had formed through extraordinary circumstances, and the reminder that sometimes the most important moments in life come from simply doing the right thing. 6 months later, James Mitchell stood in the same palace courtyard where his life had changed so dramatically, but now he wore a different uniform, one that identified him as the Palace Children's Safety Coordinator, a position that had evolved far beyond what anyone had originally envisioned. The small incident with Emma Patterson had sparked a comprehensive review of safety protocols that had led to James becoming one of the most recognized faces at Buckingham Palace. The transformation in his role had been remarkable. What began as a diplomatic solution to a protocol violation had become a genuine innovation in royal service. James now worked with schools, children's charities, and family organizations to develop educational programs about palace visits, safety awareness, and the history of royal service. His unique perspective, as someone who had served as both a traditional guard and a child advocate, gave him credibility with both institutional stakeholders and the families who visited the palace. The viral video of his heroic action had ultimately been viewed over 50 million times across various social media platforms, making him one of the most famous members of the royal staff in modern history. Documentary crews from around the world had requested interviews. Children's book publishers had approached him about telling his story, and he had received thousands of letters from families expressing their gratitude for his example of putting human welfare above rigid protocol. But perhaps the most Meaningful development had been his ongoing relationship with the Patterson family. Emma and Sarah had become regular visitors to London, staying in touch with James through letters, phone calls, and periodic visits to the palace. Emma, now 8 years old and even more spirited than before, had appointed herself as an unofficial consultant for James's children's programs, offering suggestions with the earnest authority that only a child could possess. On this particular spring morning, James was preparing for the launch of the Royal Guard Heroes educational program, an initiative designed to teach children about safety, courage, and community service through the lens of royal history. The program would travel to schools throughout the United Kingdom, bringing interactive presentations that combined entertainment with practical safety education. The irony wasn't lost on James that his moment of protocol violation had led to the creation of new protocols that were now being adopted by security organizations around the world. His story had become a case study in leadership schools, demonstrating how individual conscience and institutional loyalty could coexist rather than conflict. Emma Patterson, now a confident 8-year-old, bounded into the courtyard wearing a miniature version of the Queen's Guard uniform that had been specially made for her role as the program's junior ambassador. Her enthusiasm for the project had been infectious, and her natural charisma made her an ideal spokesperson for encouraging other children to think about safety and community responsibility. "Mr. James," Emma called out as she ran toward him, her small bearskin hat slightly askew but her smile radiant. "Mummy says we can practice the presentation one more time before the cameras arrive." Sarah followed at a more measured pace, her own transformation over the past 6 months evident in her confident bearing and professional attire. The single mother who had once struggled to afford a vacation to London was now a sought-after speaker on children's safety advocacy, her perspective as the mother whose child had been saved giving her a unique voice in national conversations about public safety and community responsibility. "I still can't believe this is really happening," Sarah confided to James as they watched Emma practice her lines with the serious concentration of a seasoned performer. "6 months ago we were just tourists taking pictures. Now Emma's going to be on television teaching other children about safety." James smiled as he watched Emma adjust her uniform with the same precision he had once applied to his own ceremonial dress. "She's going to be brilliant. She has a gift for making complex ideas seem simple and important." The morning's filming went smoothly, with Emma delivering her lines about playground safety, stranger awareness, and emergency procedures with the natural confidence of someone who truly understood their importance. Her explanation of how nice soldiers like Mr. James were always watching out for children resonated with audiences in focus groups, leading producers to expand the program beyond its original scope. During a break in filming, James received a message that the Queen wished to see him in her study. These meetings had become a monthly tradition, allowing Her Majesty to stay informed about the program's development while providing James with guidance on navigating his unique position within the royal household. "Your Majesty," James said as he entered the familiar study, "I hope you're pleased with how the program is developing." The Queen, now approaching her 100th birthday but still sharp and engaged, gestured for him to sit in the chair that had become his usual spot during these conversations. "I'm more than pleased, James. I'm proud. You've taken an extraordinary situation and transformed it into something that serves the greater good." She paused, studying his face with the perceptive gaze that had guided her through 7 decades of leadership. "Do you ever regret your decision that morning? Knowing what you know now about the consequences and complications it would create?" James considered the question carefully before responding. "Your Majesty, if I found myself in exactly the same situation today, I would make exactly the same choice. The protocols and traditions we maintain are important, but they exist to serve people, not the other way around." The Queen nodded approvingly. "That's precisely the kind of wisdom I hoped you would develop in this role. The monarchy survives not because we cling rigidly to the past, but because we understand how to honor tradition while adapting to serve contemporary needs." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door, followed by Emma's voice calling out, "Your Majesty, it's Emma. May I come in, please?" The Queen's face lit up with genuine delight. "Of course, my dear. Please come in." Emma entered with the confident bearing of someone who had become accustomed to royal surroundings, though she still performed a careful curtsy that she had been practicing for months. "Your Majesty, I wanted to invite you to watch our television program when it airs next week. Mr. James and I worked very hard on it." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," the Queen replied warmly. "I understand you're going to teach children all over the country about staying safe." "Yes," Emma exclaimed with enthusiasm. "And about how ordinary people can be heroes just by helping others when they need it. Like Mr. James did for me." As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the study, illuminating three figures from vastly different backgrounds who had been brought together by extraordinary circumstances, James reflected on the unpredictable nature of life and service. A split-second decision to abandon protocol had led to a completely new understanding of what it meant to serve the crown and protect the people. The little girl in the yellow dress who had wandered too close to danger had become a confident young advocate for children's safety. The delivery driver, whose moment of inattention had nearly caused tragedy, had become a volunteer instructor in the program, sharing his perspective on the importance of vigilance and responsibility. The Queen's Guard, who had violated centuries of protocol, had found a way to honor both tradition and conscience in service to something larger than himself. As Emma chattered excitedly about their upcoming school visits and television appearances, James realized that the greatest honor wasn't wearing a ceremonial uniform or maintaining perfect discipline at a palace post. The greatest honor was discovering that individual courage and institutional service could work together to create something that served both tradition and human need. The story that had begun with a moment of crisis had evolved into an ongoing testament to the power of putting human welfare at the center of public service. And in the years to come, as the Royal Guard Heroes program reached hundreds of thousands of children across the United Kingdom and beyond, the lesson would endure. Sometimes the most important protocol is simply doing the right thing.